So, Jason, it's good to be back for our third of four installments of our discussion on Russell Kirk's The American Cause.
Happy to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
As I am always. If you've just clicked on this conversation, this third of three. Number one, I'll tell you who we are. My name is Mike Terry. I'm the superintendent of Founders Classical Academies, and I'm here with Jason Karos, our associate superintendent for academics. We think a lot about this question of why are we here as a country, but there are two other parts to this question. So we've established in our other two segments that there are three categories of principles that we're concerned about. We're concerned about in America with a set of moral principles. We're interested in a set of political principles. And today we're going to talk about a set of economic principles that go along with the first two. So I really encourage you to go back and look at that first conversation and that second conversation, because we're following the argument that Russell Kirk is making in his book, The American Cause. Do you want to just, in a brief, I don't know, just not really summary, but maybe a couple of observations about this book, about Russell Kirk, and it's probably one of the shortest that he wrote, but it's really important. And I thought maybe you could talk just generally about it, and then we'll get into this conversation.
Yes, yeah, I think you would rightly call this a primer. You know, it's 100 pages or something like that, not very long. But Russell Kirk was a famous writer, intellectual, American intellectual, who lived for a good part of the 20th century, and he was asked by somebody to write a book for everybody, but young people in particular in the United States around the time of the Korean War, because we had a number of our soldiers taken captive by the Koreans, and they were being essentially brainwashed regarding Marxist ideology. And so there was some fear about, hey, well, what's happening? How is it that these young people are sort of going to the other side, if you will? And so he writes this book. It was pretty popular at the time, and then it was reprinted around the time of the Vietnam War for a very similar reason. And it's been in constant circulation since then. It's had a number of printings, and fortunately, it's a very readable, very accessible, but very powerful book.
So what you described was when talking about these GIs over in Korea, and that's really when we're first dealing with the Marxist threat. We hadn't really dealt with it with China during the Second World War, but now we're confronting it face to face. And I think we'll talk about this a little more in the fourth section, where we look at the afterword to the book, because what you're saying is that it basically boils down to a lack of education. That people don't understand that America existed intentionally. Most countries, they end up forming because an ethnic group or a couple of ethnic groups get together, and they're living in the same geographic space, and they find some kind of mutual advantage to working together, and over time, the idea of a people or a nation, it sort of forms, and maybe it's by force. A king has decided to consolidate multiple kingdoms. We saw that throughout the world history repeatedly. But it was different in the case of America, that you actually had mostly in the beginning one people group, American Brits, American English, coming to the colonies for various reasons. And in fact, the Declaration alludes to this but says, time comes sometimes when you have to dissolve those political bonds that bind you for various reasons. So it's kind of a reverse of that kind of organic process where they intentionally separate and declare the need for it. But it's not just that they, didn't get their way about certain things. There was a set of principles that were critical to them. And of course, we have it most directly in the form of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and they boil them down.
Yes, and just thinking about some of these soldiers who were brainwashed, it seems to me that when people are under duress, they're sort of fertile ground there for other ideas to take root, especially if the American principles that we've been talking about are not firmly rooted in you, right? So we saw that with some soldiers. It wasn't like the majority of people by any means. But then think about during, say, the Great Depression, that was a time when we actually saw the rise of socialism, Nazism, anarchism in this country, right? There were a lot of disheartened people, and people were thinking, oh, like what happened to this great American experiment? We're down and out, right? And some of these movements began to take hold. And of course, the war started not too long after that. And of course, we went in a different direction at that point. But it is really important to have the not just the experiences in daily life. Obviously, that leads to an affection for a country, but to also have a type of formal education so that you understand all of these principles that we've been talking about and can believe in them in an intellectual way as well as in the heart.
Well, so we've talked about these three high level, however you want, whatever word you want to use, types of rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The question then follows: well, how do we secure them? And I think we can see that the founding fathers had a couple of answers. The first was to establish a limited government with checks and balances that would protect the rights of the people as the primary function of the federal government. And then the second answer was to make sure that certain principles were clear, which we find in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. It's from my position, I look back, it's kind of sad that then Russell Kirk has to come along in the 50s after, the American GIs have just fought this great war. When, it wasn't the Great War, but they fought this war that saved civilization is the narrative. But yet by the 50s, nobody knows why. Mm-hmm. What is it that the country is standing for? So again, we believe that this book helps us think systematically through those three types of principles, and again, we've covered the moral and the political, and today we're going to get on to the economic. But
yes, well, let me just say something about that. That you mentioned that it's a shame, that we have to come back to these things the way that we do, but if you think about one of the topics we discussed in a previous discussion, human nature, right? We have an imperfect human nature. And if you think about economics in particular, which is the main subject for today, the natural state of things for human beings, right, throughout all of recorded history is poverty, right? People have to work extremely hard to live in something other than a state of poverty, both material poverty and spiritual poverty, right? So to get to a system of government, a regime, and then an economic system like we've had in this country for a couple hundred years, you have to keep on it. You can start with it, you can be excited about it, but it takes constant work, generation after generation. So it actually is kind of natural that you could see a slide, like you could see a descent, and so we see the same things in our lives on a daily basis with our nutrition, our eating, our moral habits, everything. If we don't stay on top of those things, we're naturally going to go down, right? So we always have to be climbing. We always have to be working. And so, Russell Kirk's book came at a time when it was necessary. And of course, we have to be constantly educated and re-educated.
So the two principles that he addresses in the book, number one is economic freedom, and number two is economic accomplishment. But you talked about kind of the natural state of man is poverty. Mm-hmm. I wonder though if the average person wants to live in poverty. And I'm not saying they do. It's more of a rhetorical question. Do people really want to live in poverty? I think the answer is no. Mm-hmm. I think we want to be able to raise our children. Everybody does, whether you're living in late stage Roman Empire or the Middle Ages or 2000 BC. You want to take care of your children. Mm-hmm. You want them to have a good life, and you want them to be healthy and to be able to grow. But clearly, Russell Kirk looks at the history of economic systems throughout the world, and he doesn't get into detail on that in this particular book. He's going to contrast it with one particular system, but he reaches the conclusion that people have to be free in order to pursue the things that they need. He says only, and the solution is that only a society which is economically free can be a just society, which answers that question: how do I get out of poverty? For the just society is the one in each man may seek the things that belong to his nature. And by nature, we understand, the desire to live and to raise your children and to do so in relative safety. And so Russell Kirk is saying, if you want these things, if you really want these things for your family, you have to be free to pursue them. So that's where he starts with economic freedom. How do you want to talk about that system? I mean, it's a huge economic discussion.
Yes.
A free market system versus some other kind of alternative.
Right. I think we could consider childhood and adulthood, right? So when we were still a colonial society and Great Britain was the fatherland, there was a period when we needed to be treated relationally like children, right? But as we matured, as our society grew, and of course, because of the great distance between the two countries, or the kingdom and the colonies, because of the ocean, we matured pretty quickly here and got to a point where there was this sort of principle of salutary neglect. We were sort of left alone. We did a lot on our own. We had local colonial governments, and we were doing well economically. And by the time of the revolution, those people that we refer to as the founding fathers realized, hey, you know what? We no longer need our mother's milk, right? We can be on our own, and we ought to be on our own. And here's why. And of course, some of that's explained in the Declaration of Independence. And I think it's kind of the same thing, with economics. And you think about a tyrannical form of let's say government that wants to determine what everybody is doing, including business owners and workers, versus a liberal one, liberal meaning a freer one, right? That recognizes that there are adults, that ought to have freedoms, right? Because they're capable of not just governing themselves to a certain degree, but also leading a life of liberty when it comes to economics, and therefore they'll flourish as a result of that. Like that's sort of the dichotomy. And I think what Russell Kirk points out is that when you look at the history of the world, when you see people that have certain conditions in place, like rule of law, so ordered liberty, and freedom, including in the economic sphere, they prosper greatly, right? And they can pursue their interests. And by pursuing their interests, they're also benefiting, other people, both in the short, and the long run. But there's one other precondition, and that's the precondition that, and he really emphasizes this quite a bit. We've talked about it before, and that is morality. Right? And the founding fathers really emphasized that in order to have this kind of liberty that we would all like, we have to have virtuous people, right? Not perfect people, right? But generally virtuous people.
Right.
Yeah.
So when is there an easy way to define what a free enterprise system is in your mind?
Well, I mean, so we have to recognize that, the word freedom is kind of a loaded word, and we can be very nuanced with it, because none of us has total freedom, right? And the founding fathers and Russell Kirk were not libertines. Like, they didn't believe people should be able to do whatever they want, any way they want, including immoral activity, right? Neither were they libertarians, like we think about modern political libertarians, right? No government or very little government interference. They wanted limited government, yes, because people are imperfect, right? There have to be boundaries. There have to be sort of protecting arms in certain areas. There are certain things that the individual should not do that a governing body ought to do, like defend a country from foreign invasion, right? And so in the area of economics, right, we're not totally free. Like, we shouldn't be able to do things that physically harm other people, right? We shouldn't pollute waters. We shouldn't, you could think about a whole bunch of things in that, regard. So basically, what a market is a market system, a free market system or free enterprise system. It's one where you've got limited government, where people get to pursue economic interactions with one another, both on a one-to-one basis and, say between businesses, and they which means they get to sign contracts, make agreements, trade, purchase goods and services, and with just a minimal type of government, regulation for the benefit of all involved. And of course, there's always a debate about how much government, right? And that's what we've been debating about in this country for many decades.
Right.
But the general principle is that it ought to be limited, because when a body of people, the government, is given too much authority, it does get corrupted, right? There is the great potential always for tyranny, and that again is what we've seen throughout history, and we've seen it at different times in our country.
Yeah. He talks about on page 98, 99. I just kind of charted out. I need a board back here where I can put little graphics up. But he basically said that in any society, in order for it to work, things have to get done. And there's one of two ways that the private sector can get things done, and that's either through charity or through everyone making their best effort and seeing who comes up with the best solution, which you call competition. Yes. So the idea is that you could get a lot done. Say you're living in a feudal system where the lords of the manor see that the serfs need a road in order to bring the food into the castle, and so he goes out and he builds the road, and they're able to bring the goods in, and maybe there are many different other types of needs that the community has. Maybe there's this the people aren't as healthy as they need to be, and the Lord decides, I'm going to build a clinic out here. Well, that's all charity. He's doing all these things for the people, and we can take that into a society like ours and say charity is a wonderful thing, and actually Americans are very charitable, and that's been observed historically, that Americans generously take care of each other when there are problems. They don't wait for someone to come help us, or at least that had been the tradition. But the reality is he describes it as there's not enough of that to get everything done. And at the end of the day, that the majority of whatever goods and services are required have to be produced because there's an incentive to do it. And where there's properly aligned incentives, in other words, if I spend my time making shoes, then no one's going to stop me from selling them. And then if I make good shoes, I get a reputation for having good shoes, and other people come and pay me for them. And so my incentive is to make good shoes. So that benefits the society as a whole. And that's what we want, because whenever somebody sees an opportunity or a need, they can jump right in and make their own contribution based on their skills and their knowledge and their experience. The problem comes in when a governmental entity, or the Lord or whoever it is, decides that shoes aren't important, that hoes are important, or shovels are important, or swords are important, that something else is important. Now the people don't. If I'm the cobbler, maybe I'll make boots if you're planning a war with France, but because I do make things that go on feet. But then he comes to me and says, no, I need you to make armor now. Now I'm no longer working out of charity. I'm no longer working out of a properly aligned incentive system. I'm working out of compulsion. I'm being told what to do. And that creates this whole system of misalignment of incentives. Nobody knows why they should do a particular kind of work. And then the free market breaks down. And we saw that in Europe. The term free market actually comes from the markets that used to run in Europe that were totally unregulated in the Middle Ages, until the kings and lords started figuring out, if I tax that, I'm going to have money for my wars. Yeah. So the free market, which originated in that term originated in those periods, became corrupted, and that's what happens. So there's also another piece of this, but let me just pause there for a minute for you to.
Yeah, no, I think that that word incentive is very important. It's definitely important when you think about what a market economy is. Just thinking about your shoe example, if some authority tells the shoemaker what price to charge for the shoes, not only will that that outside person not necessarily understand the basic economics, like what are the costs of materials, what is the labor, involved in making these things, and then what is the price point at which customers will actually buy it. It could not only ruin the sale of the shoes, but then it becomes a disincentive for the shoemaker.
Right.
I'm not going to make shoes anymore because, first of all, I don't like somebody from the outside who doesn't know about shoes telling me what to do.
Right.
And then secondly, I can't make a living because now, the price of this thing is at a low price point, right? And so I have to therefore do something else. And so that only takes the shoemaker, out of the market. But then you have a disgruntled citizen, right? And that's not good for anybody. Yeah.
Well, I think about your experience as an educator, and at a certain point, you look at your two children, and you said, I want them to have a classical education.
Yes.
And I don't know what your entire thought process was, but at some point you start looking around where maybe I want to start a school.
Mm-hmm.
Like, who starts schools? Well, we saw in the late 90s the movement of the charter schools coming along, where anybody who thought they could start a school, they were allowed to start a school. Now, there were a lot of crummy schools that were started, but there are a lot of excellent schools that were started. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the classical schools are putting the traditional public schools on notice. That you need to offer a better education. And you were a big part of that. You came to Texas. Mm-hmm. You started a school. You had a vision for the type of school it would be. And you were basically allowed to see who would come to your school.
Right. And
Founders Classical Academy of Louisville is a highly successful school, probably our most successful in the Founders brand, as the oldest and I think a very stable school. It has been successful, but that's an example of the incentives being aligned. The state of Texas said, we want better schools. Mm-hmm. We could ask our traditional educators to do it, but they've been doing it, and we still think we could have better schools. Let's put some incentives out there for people to come and start new and better schools, which you did. And I think it's a great example mm-hmm. of this principle.
Yes. So there, in what you just described, so you've kind of included the concept of incentives there. Certainly choice for the people involved in mm-hmm. in serving at the school, and choice for the parents. But there's another element of charter schools, and this connects to free markets in general. And it's one of I've got a list of sort of enablers of economic success that correspond to what Kirk talked about in these couple chapters here. I just want to mention one right now because it connects to what you talked about, and that is, if you're going to have a market economy, a free market, free enterprise system, you have to have the freedom to fail. Mm-hmm. So if I decide to use whatever capital I have to start a business, and I am successful, great. If I'm not successful, I ought to close down the business and do something else. But if the government intervenes and doesn't allow me to close my doors, then they're propping up something that's not successful. And that's not a good use of investments. Mm-hmm. And it sends negative signals, right? If I'm not leading a good school, if the people serving at the school aren't doing well, if the curriculum's not great, and people decide, okay, Founders Louisville is not the place, we're going to go to this other school down the road, it ought to close, right? I mean, especially when we think about educating children, we want to give the very best. We want to give something excellent to the children, right? And so we don't want to prop up schools in this case that are not doing what they ought to be doing, which is teaching students excellently, right? So this concept of failure, is also built into it. Like, you're not in a free market, there should be no guaranteed success, right? There are all kinds of factors that are involved in successful operations.
Right. And there's a piece of that I want to come back to that is related to the freedom to fail, and that's that you had said, if you're successful, great. Well, I want to come back to that idea because I think that's the next principle, or a good way to talk about it. But before we do that, the other thing he talks about in this section is the great economic trade that tends to happen, and we really have seen it in the 20th and early 21st century, and that's trading economic freedom for economic security. And we can have a long conversation about why the people are economically insecure. There's a lot of factors that play into it. I believe that most of them have to do with government intervention. You look at the creation of the welfare state, and it purportedly was started for a good reason. The Widows and Orphans program, after the war, all these GIs had died and left, their wives and their children, and somebody needed to take care of them. But it was turned into something that was for everyone in all situations that fell below a certain line. The great safety net, as we talk about, and at a certain point, you say, well, we could let everyone be free to pursue their own ends, but what about all these people who can't? We've got to be there to help them, and it's a very generous sort of perspective, but I don't think it looks at second and third order consequences, where gradually your economy becomes one of security and central planning. And now there's other reasons for the central planning. It's ideology, it's issues with the banking industry, centralization of the monetary system. So there's a lot of that plays into it. But every time the government takes an action, the trade happens. Every time the government picks the winners and losers, a trade happens. Every time the government says, don't worry if you don't have a job, we're going to take care of you, the trade happens. And you end up with, I don't want to be inaccurate about it, but I've heard people say that 50% of the country pays no taxes. And
federal taxes,
income taxes. Yeah. Well,
Mm-hmm.
clearly, like they're paying sales tax,
Right,
and other things as they're making purchases, but they're not paying income tax. Well, that suggests that their income is too low. So now everyone is taking care of them, and we're trying to provide economic security, promoting that over economic freedom.
Yes. Yeah, I think so. Henry Hazlitt, in his book Economics in One Lesson, that our seniors read in their economics courses, has one central question in the book, and then he, in each chapter, applies that question to different things that governments typically do in the economic sphere. And the question is basically, what are the long-term secondary consequences of an economic policy, not just the immediate visible effects, right? And then you were alluding to that earlier, and that's
like
important.
the broken window fallacy.
Right, exactly. Or like governments building bridges and highways that are not necessarily right. Like, what are the effects of those things, not just in the immediate future, but down the road? And so, thinking about what you described before, what is the effect of a government collecting a lot of tax money to then care for citizens' daily needs, rather than having a society that promotes incentives, that promotes the kinds of economic liberties that we're talking about here, and where individuals can then flourish and in some ways have to be motivated, right, to pursue a good end, right? So what is the difference in both the short and the long term? And I think when you look at the societies that have these deep, not just social safety nets, but you used the phrase welfare state before, you don't see economic flourishing for the great majority of the people. You see people, good number of people living in poverty. You don't see a lot of economic dynamism. And sometimes people say, "Oh, well, that's not true. Like, what about these Scandinavian countries?"
I always talk about Sweden.
Yeah. But these countries actually, they're not social welfare states. They actually have most of them very free economies in most regards. In fact, in some ways today, in 2025, freer than the United States in terms of low regulation and so on. They tend to emphasize a couple of things that we don't necessarily do as much in this country, like paying for tuition or post high school training of some sort, things like that. But in many other ways, they're very free, and they do have dynamic economies. So yeah, so that's a critical thing. And I think what Russell Kirk is saying is that we want the most liberty, right, with the necessary government interventions, with the moral climate that will lead to flourishing. Because again, you could have these kinds of freedoms with limited government, healthy government involvement, and then immorality.
Right.
And then what do you get? You get what some people today would call like crony capitalism, runaway capitalism, whatever it is, right? That's just not good for human beings.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and I think we see a lot of that. It's funny, whenever somebody brings up Sweden, I think to myself, gosh, I guess if we just didn't spend $1 trillion a year on the military, which they don't have to do in Sweden. You know, you talk about what are they doing versus what are they not doing. You know, they're and listen, I'm not advocating for high taxes. I don't like the income tax. I think it robs from people, and I think there are other ways that the federal government can provide for its mandates. But in that case, whenever someone brings up, well, look at Sweden taking care of their people. Well, look at all the other commitments they're not making. They're not sending money to foreign countries. They're not building up a massive military. They're not maintaining, bases all around the world. They're not involved in every country's economic system. They get just to focus on their people.
Yes.
And actually, that's the call of the government is to focus on the particular needs that the people have, but first and foremost protecting their rights. And if they're doing that in Sweden, then maybe we should be looking more at what's happening in places like that.
Well, what's interesting is that there are certain organizations like the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, and others that rank countries with an economic freedom index, and some of those Scandinavian countries are in the top 10. And the United States has fallen behind them in recent decades, sadly.
Well, and I think that gets to Chapter 8 because I sit here and listen to that, and I'm familiar with those rankings, and I cheer for those countries. I don't say, oh, pull them down. They don't deserve to be up there, or countries shouldn't be prospering off of freedom. That's there's got to be losers in that sort of environment. And of course, we know there are in a free economic system. You said there must be the possibility of failure, because that when there's a possibility of failure, in my view, there's a deeper thought, deeper analysis that goes into an initiative or an enterprise before you launch it. I mean, you really want to make sure that you're going to be successful, or do everything you can to be successful. And when you have a situation where you don't have to worry about failure, where every failure comes with a bailout, well, then that's a society that's just going to keep wasting money.
Yeah. Well, think about it at the individual level. How many growing up, how many famous American entrepreneurs did you learn about that failed multiple times before they hit it big, right? Henry Ford, people like that. And of course, there are modern entrepreneurs as well that we could bring to mind. But the thing about it is, thinking about the virtue element of this, when you fail, it's an opportunity for you to grow. Number one, hopefully, it can bring you some humility if you didn't have it before. But number two, we promote in our schools that we want students to persevere. Yeah. When you fall down, get up, try again. Don't do it the same exact way as you did it before, right? Maybe you have to make some changes. And that's a part of the American spirit as well. So when we talk about that age-old idea of the American dream, it was never believed that you could just come here and instantaneously be more successful than your ancestors back in Europe, right? You had to work hard. For that. Yeah. And for the people, so we had this phrase algerism, that goes back to the 19th century. This idea that if you're hardworking, you persevere, you're virtuous, you're industrious, and so on, you're going to achieve success, right? That's kind of part of the traditional American spirit, but it's not easy.
Right. Well, what according to our founders is the goal? I mean, it's not happiness; it's pursuit of it. That the government is trying to facilitate an environment in which you can chase, whatever it is that fulfills you, and within moral bounds. I think that's important, as you've been saying. So I think that we definitely have to be okay with our kids failing, but promoting to them this idea that you keep striving, that you keep seeking that thing that you're trying to provide that impacts the good for yourself and for society. And I think that, again, it gets into Chapter 8, where he talks about the second principle, which is it was kind of an interesting conversation that he unpacks there, is that it's American economic accomplishment is we are pursuing that, I guess, as proof that this liberty that we've hopefully provided to our people is efficacious, that it leads somewhere.
Yes.
But at the same time, he said that prosperity, is no guarantee of happiness.
Right.
So to me, the principle is that number one, we should expect that when we are in a free system that people are going to prosper in a variety of ways. But in my view, we should be rooting for it. We should be cheering for these entrepreneurs who are different from the everyday person, because they're experts in 10 different things and put it all together to create this enterprise that employs all these people and produces something good for everybody. We should root for that.
Yes.
But instead we make them the villains of the story.
Yeah, well, and in some instances there are villains because there are people,
Right.
because they're humans that do immoral things. But but
they got outside of the rails, right?
Yes,
We said
yes.
they're moral boundaries, and
Right. Right. But there are many successful people that did what they did in a more virtuous way, and many people that you don't even know about, right? I know who's the guy, the famous finance guy that has a podcast and the book about savings and all of that.
Oh, the guy out of Nashville tells you to no debt.
Yeah.
I'm going at the age, or I can't remember anybody's name, but yeah.
And now I didn't even know where I was going to go with that. But
Well, I mean, a successful entrepreneur.
He was talking about the great number of millionaires that we have in this country that you don't even know. It
Right.
could just be your next door neighbor, but they spend money well, they save money well, they're just living good, ordinary lives, and you don't even know it, right? Not that being a millionaire is the litmus test for happiness, to be sure, but just giving you a sense of
Right.
People associate sometimes wealth and vice, but that's not
No, it's
necessarily-
that. Those aren't. They don't correlate. We need a mic on our producer Shannon so that she can tell us who these people are when we can't remember names. She can have a little thing in front of her and type it in. The guy in Nashville who does not like debt.
Yeah.
But of course, I know who you're talking
we'll think
about.
about it as soon as it's done. Right?
Yes. But he says that we have to avoid smugness as we're looking at what America has accomplished. Yes, we want that as a goal. We expect accomplishment. We in Founders we talk about that. We expect our students to be accomplished. We expect them, like when they go off to college, we expect to hear back that they're on their way to some kind of great impact. We've spent a lot of time, sometimes 13 years, working with our students, and we're not doing it for nothing. And so that kind of embodies, while that's not an economic outcome, I mean, in a way it is for us. We're running a nonprofit organization, but it's still run like a business, and we still expect it to be successful. And the way we measure that is not necessarily the bottom line when it comes to finances, although we need to be solvent. It's our students and what they accomplish. So we do expect, as a principal, accomplishment.
Yes, and so now I remember what I wanted to say, where I was going with that comment about successful people and virtuous ones and villainous ones. Russell Kirk compares the free market system to a Marxist system. And
he does quite a bit,
right?
Yeah.
And so one of the elements of Marxism is trying to equalize in some way, like everybody's spot or lot, in life, which brings necessarily inequality and discrimination, because you have to then take those who have succeeded in some particular area down to the level of everybody else, right, in that area, Whereas what you're discussing here is that, look, there are people, given the conditions in a society, that will thrive tremendously in all kinds of areas. And some of them are in areas that enable people to become extremely wealthy. So, like if you're the world's best knitter, you're not going to probably become an Elon Musk, right, in terms of wealth. But in both situations, you have the setting, like, to pursue your interest and to thrive in it. And we have a lot of very talented people that have worked extremely hard to improve their circumstances and enjoy whatever it is that they're doing. And this is what we want in a society.
Yes.
Like we shouldn't our just thinking about Kirk, the founders, the American principles historically, we're not supposed to have puppet masters that are determining where everybody ends up, how much money people are supposed to make. We want people to flourish. We want a government that allows those conditions to happen because it protects us and so on, right? And it's the same thing with our students. We don't expect all students to achieve at the same level. We want them to get an excellent education. We want them to grow in their character so that they'll lead good lives. But that doesn't mean that they're all going to earn a high income or the same income, or eventually move into the most prestigious positions in our society, right? There are things that are more important than that, but we're not equal. We're not equal as human beings. We have different gifts and talents, abilities. We also have caps on our abilities, right? So I think that's one of the other things that built into this, and that's natural, right? So one of the things that Kirk emphasizes in here, that with a system like Marxism, socialism, any kind of totalitarian system, it's unnatural, what those regimes are trying to do, which also then leads to disincentives for people. And so when you think about the Soviet Union and the production, let's say, of the workers in a society like that, it didn't compare to the freer societies of Europe and the United States. When China was more fully a Marxist society, even though they've got great people in China and historically a wonderful civilization going back to ancient times, right? I mean, when you're under that kind of oppression, you don't have the incentives to give your best in a lot of different areas, right? And so the production levels of people in countries like that is substantially lower than those in a market society. And you can just apply that concept to lots of different areas.
I agree. And I think that if you can go into this little book, and he'll unpack this case of a controlled economy versus a free economy, and using the comparison of Marxism and the free enterprise system as those two different things. But one of the things that I think you find in Marxism that's wrong is that it pits these two groups of people who actually have the same interests against each other. So you've got these innovators, these people that I look, shoemaker, I can show you how to make 10 times the number of shoes at the same quality level in half the time, and the shoemaker's like, I never thought about that. And then you have all these workers that then come in to help make the shoes that weren't employed by the shoemaker originally, and they're all, I think, they have the same incentive: make great shoes for people. I don't think anybody wants to make a crummy product, at least not in a free economy, because they know that no one's going to buy it and they're going to fail. But Marx says no, that the innovator's not really an innovator. He's stealing the knowledge and keeping it for himself and keeping it from the people. When that's not really what's happening at all, because those people who are now working and making shoes and their lives are getting better, I mean, they may have been digging in the dirt in the society previously. Or working in terrible conditions in mines or whatever the classic example may be. So it's just one of the fallacies that in a controlled economy, especially in a Marxist controlled economy, that the people have different interests, but they all have the same interest. They want to take care of their families. They want to produce something good. They want to look at their day's work and say, I've done something meaningful. And it just so happens that there are certain people that are more equipped to organize all of that.
Yes.
And we have said in the free market economy that if somebody can organize all of that production and do it better and more efficiently and meet the need, that person should be rewarded for that, for that work. And I think that's fair, and I think we should be celebrating it up to the point where they're getting help from the government to pile their treasure trove up or expand their business in a way that is anti-competitive.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the in a free market system, the red flags start going up.
Right, right. Yeah. Well, just thinking about this idea of this kind of incentive, there's the biblical principle of if you don't work, you won't eat.
Yeah.
Which was put into practice with the original settlers in this country, right? In Plymouth, they were starving because they initially tried to set up a type of communal
That's right.
settlement there, and there was not an incentive, to work because everybody was supposedly sharing everything, and then that had to change pretty quickly, and then they came back to the scriptures, if you don't work, you're not eating. So there are going to be people that will try to take advantage, of that kind of scenario, which then becomes a disincentive for those who have the initiative, who do want to work hard no matter what. Like when they see that there are sort of these freeloaders, right, that aren't taking care of their portion, then it's a drag on everybody, in the long run.
So, a couple of great chapters. I encourage all of you, if you've watched the first two and now this, if you haven't gotten the book, you really need to read it. We recommend it to all of our school leaders. I don't know if this is assigned to any of our students in any of our classes, but it'd be excellent for students as well. Can you give us? We've got one more conversation on this book, and then that'll wrap up the series. Can you give us a little preview of the conversation that we'll have about the last part of the book?
Yes. So we're going to be discussing the afterword. And the afterword for this particular edition, the latest edition, was written by a gentleman named Gleaves Whitney, who is a classicist. He's I think still working at a university, but he was a big fan, as many intellectuals are, of Russell Kirk. And he basically writes this chapter that deals with what some people might refer to as American exceptionalism, but not in a haughty kind of way, but basically just sort of laying out, okay, here are the facts of history. When you've got a regime of liberty that has a market economy, this is the result. And as a result of the creation of this kind of society with hardworking, industrious people and a good modicum of virtue, then you get results that not just impact the people that live in this country, but impact others around the world in a positive way. And so he basically takes the reader through, a series of accomplishments and basically tries to make the case, and sort of summing up what Russell Kirk is talking about, for, all of these principles that Kirk is talking about. Right?
Yeah, I think that's an important conversation. I think one of the things that maybe we'll spend a little bit of time on next time, and we can wrestle with it, is to what extent do we still have a free economy? To what extent do we still adhere to political principles? Yes. To what extent do we still care about moral precepts? 1950s was a long time ago, and yes, there's a lot of water under the bridge. A lot of things have happened in our country since then. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about things like the California fires that are going on at the beginning of 2025. But, we can see some examples of what happens when, the government is too involved and then doesn't follow through. Yes. But we've seen that in hurricane situations and in the Carolinas and in other scenarios. I want to be realistic about where our country is. I think it's important for our students to wrestle with it. Yes. We talk about heroes and villains, and I think that governments can be heroes and villains as well. And I think it's important for our students to be able to see, what happens when you abandon these core principles, where you no longer have a cause. And while I don't think Russell Kirk is saying that we don't have a cause, he's laid out what it is, and writing in the 50s and 60s. Couldn't probably foresee 50 years into the future what the country would look like. Right. But I think we need to consider it and be realistic, because I think to a certain extent our students are going to be fighting against some mindsets, some worldviews. Yes.
Well, I think it's a really fair point, because when history teachers or government teachers traditionally teach about, say, the Constitution, the branches of government, and the main portions and functions of both the federal and state governments, they think about it in terms of the way that it was created to be oftentimes. And what they don't, or maybe students don't often take away, is that in the latter half of the 20th century, a sort of invisible, to some extent, fourth branch was created, which we call the administrative state, the bureaucratic state.
Right.
That it does a lot of extra constitutional things, right? And so, yeah, that's just an example of how there's sort of the book and what students are learning about government, and then what is actually happening. And I think in the case of Russell Kirk, you said you wrote in the mid 20th century, and since that time there are things that have changed in the economic sphere and in the political sphere, right? That maybe he'd be writing another book about
I think he would
if he were alive today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. All right, so we're going to stop there. That I think is this has been an excellent conversation as always. I hope you'll come back for our fourth installment, and I also wanted to say that we have a lot more of this kind of content coming. We have teachers that are going to be talking about the things they teach about in class, and I think we're going to be hearing more about the successes of our students and what they're involved in. There are many things that we have to talk about. I think we teach for a living, and I think that there is going to be a lot of excellent content that's going to be coming forth on our site. So I hope you will come back for that, and in the meantime, have a great time with your family and your friends, and make sure you tell more people about the successes, if you're a parent, your students are having at Founders Classical Academies.
Thank you.